Hi, today we will talk about why we should tour Eastern Europe. Okay, now our tour will go through Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Czech Republic, Austria, Slovakia, and up in Hungary. All these countries are involved in this story. But my hope is to increase Americans' knowledge about Eastern Europe and its strategic location with regard to Russia, with the hopes that U.S. foreign policy will be more supportive of these countries that currently few Americans know anything about. In fact, in September 2017, I joined a 12-person bicycle tour of the Baltic states, riding through Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. And when I was invited, I had to Google, where are the Baltics? I didn't know them different from the Balkans, which is further south. Anyway, while on the tour, we learned from our tour guide that the Baltic states are strategic in containing Russian aggression, despite my and most other Americans' ignorance about them. Because Russia is meddling with these countries well beyond what Russia has attempted in the United States. Through disinformation and interference, Russia works to sow distrust in elections and institutions, pit social groups against one another, and undermine the notion of truth on which democratic discourse depends. In dozens of countries, including the Baltics, Russia has employed cyber attacks, fake news, propaganda, and social media manipulation to undermine open societies while providing material support to illiberal social and political groups, including radical populists on both sides of the ideological spectrum, attempting to disrupt political discourse there. Now, the people of the Baltic states are particularly proud of how their independence from the Soviet Union was won. The Baltic states are among the earliest in their resistance to Russian or Soviet occupation of their countries. Significant events include the Baltic Way or Baltic Chain of Freedom. Now, this is an awesome demonstration, a peaceful political demonstration that occurred in '89. About 2 million people of the Baltic states joined hands, forming almost a 420-mile human chain from Tallinn, Estonia, through Riga, Latvia, to Vilnius, Lithuania. The campaign reportedly gathered 700,000 people in Estonia, 500,000 in Latvia, and 1 million in Lithuania, which is an awesome percentage when you see how small their actual population is. In March of '90, the Lithuanian Supreme Council announced the restoration of Lithuanians' independence. Clearly, that's not what the Soviets were wanting at the time. They became the first Soviet republic to announce its secession from the USSR. The USSR imposed an economic blockade by stopping to deliver supplies of raw materials, particularly oil, to Lithuania. Then in January of '91, there was Bloody Sunday in Lithuania. It was following lethal attacks on demonstrators at the Vilnius TV tower and the radio and television committee building by Soviet troops. They drew large crowds, 20,000 during the night, more than 50,000 in the morning, as independence supporters gathered around the Lithuanian Supreme Council building in Vilnius. People started building anti-tank barricades, setting up defenses inside surrounding buildings. Despite columns of military trucks, BMPs, and tanks moving into the vicinity of the Supreme Council, Soviet military forces retreated instead of attacking. Same day in Riga, Latvia, about 700,000 people gathered as a demonstration. As night came, following requests from the Lithuanian government, agricultural and construction machines and trucks full of logs arrived in Riga to build barricades in the city to block streets to protect objects deemed of strategic interest. Supreme Council buildings, Council of Ministers, Latvian television, and so on. About 20 people were killed by Soviet troops as the troops tried to quell the uprising. However, independence in Estonia came more peacefully. but by extensive political and diplomatic efforts by the Estonian people. The first signs of radical changes in society emerged in Estonia in spring of 1987, when the Soviet plans to establish phosphate mines in northern Estonia were revealed. Numerous protests broke out and petitions were signed against the new mines in what became known as the Phosphorite War. Then came the singing revolution. Between 1986 and 1991, the people of Estonia protested against Soviet occupiers in large rallies. Although these protests were fundamentally peaceful, Estonians used a weapon powerful enough to rattle an empire: song. Patriotic songs, to be precise, which the Soviets had outlawed in Estonia. Thousands upon thousands would assemble to sing in defiance. This documentary unveils the story of a population that stood up against their oppressors with nothing but their voices and their pride. In August 1991, the hardline members of the Soviet government attempted to take control of the Soviet Union. Later that month, the Estonians and the Latvian parliament proclaimed independence. The coup in Russia failed, but the collapse of the Soviet Union became unavoidable. By August 28, 1991, the European community welcomed the restoration of the sovereignty and independence of the Baltic states. The Soviet Union recognized the Baltic independence on September 6, 1991. Independence, freedom wins. However, some fear that Putin's grand strategy is to rebuild Russia's empire of buffer states in an attempt to assuage his nation's cultural paranoia regarding outside invaders. They're driven by historic invasions by Napoleon in 1812, in which he captured Moscow, and by the Nazis in World War II, in which at least 25 million Soviet, or mostly Russian, citizens died. The core of the problem is that while Russians can deter a military attack, Kremlin sees the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and Washington as attempting to subvert Moscow domestically, threatening the security of Putin's current regime in Moscow. Russia and Belarus lie immediately east of the Baltic states. There's also the Russian enclave of Kaliningrad, with its vast military arsenal that borders the southwest portion of Lithuania on the Baltic Sea. On the military base in Kaliningrad, Putin has installed a complex of what has come to be known as anti-access, anti-denial weapons, including the highly advanced S-400 surface-to-air missile and the Iskander surface-to-air-surface missile. Between them, these missiles can neutralize NATO air and surface units, keeping naval forces from moving beyond Copenhagen to the Baltic Sea, far from Gdansk, Poland, and its industrial ship offloading facilities. As you can see, Kaliningrad is this oblast or enclave here that Russia retained when the Soviet Union collapsed. And there's only a small space here between Kaliningrad and Belarus that many materials would need to go through by land. What makes it worse when you go from Poland, which was not in the Soviet Union, to Lithuania, which was in the Soviet Union, there's a change in train railway standards, and so there's one set of tracks here and a different configuration of tracks once you reach Lithuania, which obviously causes some difficulty in transportation. So, lots of military in Kaliningrad. There is a multinational NATO battalion in each country, which is not enough to provoke Russia, but big enough to deter it. All three Baltic states spend around 2% of their gross domestic product on defense, which is the NATO target that Trump often berated allies for not meeting. But since Russia grabbed Crimea, Lithuania has brought back conscription, that is drafting of soldiers. Estonia has it too, and training includes guerrilla tactics. In the event that Russia invades the Baltic states, America could immediately recognize that an attack upon one is an attack upon all. basically invoking Article 5 of the NATO treaty. It is highly likely that Russia perceives that any aggressive action sufficient to trigger Article 5 of NATO would result in direct military conflict with at least several key NATO members. Thus, Russia has conducted activities just under the threshold perceived as aggressive enough to trigger a greater NATO response. The Baltic states have frequently strived to communicate to their fellow members of NATO and the European Union the threat that Russia poses to European security order. Obviously, their voices were not very well heard until February 22, when Russia invaded Ukraine. With many Russians still living in the Baltic countries, and Russian being one of the 4 languages commonly spoken, which is the native language of the country, Russian, German, and increasingly English, many within Russia, particularly Putin, desire to again acquire these countries into their sphere of influence, or to occupy them as Russia has in the Crimean portion of Ukraine and part of the country of Georgia. This relates to Putin's belief that Russia is actually borderless. That is, Russia is wherever Russian-speaking people live. This concerns many of the people of these countries, as well as NATO. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are the only former Soviet nations that have joined the European Union and NATO. About 25% of Estonia's people are Russian. Well, over 25% of Latvia's citizens are Russian. Lithuania, with just a small border with Kaliningrad, has a much smaller Russian population, about 6%. The problem, however, is that the Russian speakers depend for their news on Russian media, largely controlled by the Kremlin, which worries Baltic governments. Lithuania banned a Russian TV channel for broadcasting lies about the country's history. These Russian media just have lots of propaganda and just plain a lot of lies. The Baltic states also have good reasons to be concerned beyond that. You know, in 2007, there was a problem about the relocation of the monument to the liberators of Tallinn. People in Estonia no longer wanted to celebrate the Soviet Union. Obviously, that brought a lot of anger among people who were supporting Russia. You know, for many ethnic Estonians, Red Army soldiers were not liberators. They were seen as occupiers. And the bronze soldier is a painful symbol of the half century of Soviet oppression. So in 2007, the Estonian government decided to move the bronze soldier from the center of Tallinn to a military cemetery in the outskirts of the city. They didn't destroy it, they just moved it. The decision sparked outrage in Russian language media, and the Russian speakers took to the streets. Protests were exasperated by false Russian news reports claiming that the statue and the nearby Soviet war graves were being destroyed. In April of 2007, Tallinn erupted into 2 nights of rioting and looting. 156 people were injured, 1 person died, and 1,000 people were detained. Okay, now that was in 2007, and here's the statue that was moved. Also in 2007, a series of cyber attacks on Estonian computers began with swamped websites of Estonian organizations, including Estonian Parliament, banks, ministries, newspapers, and broadcasters, with the government blamed on Russia. In 2008, while the Summer Olympics was going in Beijing, the Russian invasion forces entered South Ossetia and another breakaway province in Georgia. So that was about 20% of Georgia's recognized territory. And those have now become large Russian military bases with thousands of Russian troops and hundreds of tanks and armored vehicles in both regions. Now, Russia is continually testing NATO's defenses. Sometimes it does this by buzzing warplanes briefly into Estonia airspace to see how quickly the defenders respond. More often, it does it digitally, with the veneer of deniability. Attacks are routed via compromised computers that can be anywhere in the world. Lights on a big screen at Estonian Information System Authority, the government body, show them pinging in from all around the world. Lithuania itself suffered 50,000 hacks in 2017. And more than 13 billion were laundered through the banks in Estonia, with accounts traced to sources close to Putin. Then in February of 2014, became the problem with Ukraine. Made several military incursions into Ukrainian territory. After Euromaidan protests in the fall of the Ukrainian president, Yanukovych, Russian soldiers without insignias took control of strategic positions and infrastructure within the Ukrainian territory of Crimea. Russia then annexed Crimea after a, quote, rigged referendum in which Crimeans allegedly voted to join the Russian Federation, according to official results. Russia has defended its annexation of Ukraine's Crimea Peninsula by arguing it has a right to protect Russian speakers outside its borders. Remember, anywhere where Russian speakers reside, that's part of Russia. There's their thought. In this process, Ukraine lost up to 80% of its navy when Crimea was snatched in 2014. And Russia's invasion of eastern Ukraine and the annexation of Crimea led to a war that's killed over 10,000 people and still rages. And now, after the Russian invasion in February of 2022 and ongoing, thousands and thousands of more. Also, in 2018, Russia fired upon and seized 2 Ukrainian warships and a military tugboat sailing towards the Crimean Bridge, which is right here between Crimea and mainland Ukraine. That bridge was built too low to allow 144 of the biggest ships that once called Mariupol. They're too tall to slip under its 30-meter structure, 33-meter structure, into the Sea of Azov from the Black Sea, effectively cutting off the Ukrainian ports that they have Mariupol and here. So basically, they no longer have access to the oceans. This raises tensions in Estonia and Latvia due to Russians' longstanding complaints over Estonians' insistence that the large Russian-speaking minority in the east of Estonia must be able to speak Estonian in order to obtain citizenship, be able to vote in elections. Mr. Putin has called the breakup of the Soviet Union the greatest geopolitical catastrophe in the 20th century. Discussions of history in Estonia often start with the phrase, Stalin murdered my grandparents. The sense that their giant neighbor does not truly respect their independence, let alone its membership in the EU and the NATO since 2004, pervades Baltic politics to this day. In 2014, a team of hackers called Sandworm, a hacker group traced to Russia, planted black energy malware on targets including Polish energy firms and Ukrainian government agencies. Sandworm knocked out power in portions of Ukraine in late December 2015 and in 2016, the country became under even broader wave of attacks, hitting Ukraine's pension fund, country's treasury, its seaport authority, its ministries and infrastructure, defense, and finance. The hackers again hit Ukraine's railway company, this time knocking out its online booking system for days, right in the midst of the holiday travel system. Russia isn't only testing its cyber war activities, it's also feeling out the edges of what the international community will tolerate. The Kremlin meddled with the Ukrainian election and faced no repercussions. They tried similar tactics in Germany, France, and the United States in 2016. Russian hackers turned off the power in Ukraine with impunity. For now, experts say that while Russia's grid attacks may be aggressive, they may actually have been comparatively restrained compared to what experts believe the hackers could have done in Ukraine or elsewhere in the world, including in the US. Instead, Moscow seems to be signaling its capabilities, perhaps as a deterrent against actions that the United States and its allies might take, such as a NATO response to Russian invasion of the Baltics or other countries bordering Russia. And then they've obviously tested our response with invasion of Ukraine in 2022, which thankfully the Western countries have stuck together and opposed. Now, one of the problems with all this media exposure is how well do countries protect themselves against misinformation? Now, Finland has really been famous for how well they do that, but some of the Baltic countries and the other countries that we'll be visiting are not so well protected. As you can see, Hungary in particular is not protected at all, very open or vulnerable to Soviet propaganda. Well, Russia conducted a massive Russian military exercise in 2017 in Belarus between Russia and the Baltic states. NATO estimated that about 40,000 Russian military members and the civilians participated in the exercise, including 13,000 troops and 250 tanks. Russia's application of such hybrid warfare, namely the use of the presence of large-scale conventional forces close to the border of target states, is seen by the Baltic states as coercion for them to cooperate with Russia. Obviously, with Belarus being right against these borders of these countries, particularly Lithuania, it's a concern. And obviously, Belarus has then been used as a staging point for the attack on Kyiv in February 2022. So the Baltic states broadly welcomed deterrence measures agreed at NATO's Wales Summit of 2014 to form the Readiness Action Plan. A core feature of the RAP is a 5,000 strong, very high readiness task force created within the NATO response force. Nevertheless, many of the Baltic Sea is a work in progress, with the current arrangement under RAP stresses the tripwire of small allied rotations rather than a robust defense of their countries. Now, again, after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there has been some strengthening of the NATO presence in some of these Baltic countries. Now, one of these improvements is there is a movement of the NATO air base from which was near Šiauliai, Lithuania, to close to Tallinn, and more planes there. So it's also been made NATO interoperable. In other words, they're coordinating their communications and all that kind of stuff. And they hosted in 2014 the NATO Baltic Air Policing patrols, and 4 Danish F-15s arrived there. In 2015, it was also announced that aerial assets from the American operations Atlantic Resolve would be based there. So bigger presence there now in Estonia than there previously had been. Now, our bike tour in September 17 was only in the Baltic states. As can be seen above, the threats to the Baltic states are shared by most of the former Soviet Union republics bordering Russia. And now, that is all history with the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine. Hopefully, by being more informed, we can promote the American values of private property and unhampered market economy, the rule of law, political freedom in a democracy, constitutional guarantees of freedom of religion of the press, human rights, minority protections, and the international peace based on free trade.